Hello everyone, welcome to another edition of The Orthodox Nationalist. This is Matthew Raphael Johnson, and it's the 19th of August, 2020. Again, this is independent scholarship and journalism, so I ask for your financial support. It can't function without it, and for those who have donated, you know who you are. I thank you very much. But today is going to be a bit of a comedic discussion or lecture on my part. Since we're talking about the riots in Belarus, I had a program with Sven last week dealing with the same topic. This continues to be more or less front-page news, and of course Johnson's Law applies. Because it's an obscure country that really no one knows anything about, the American media can either lie about it, because so few can contradict them, or simply make a mistake because they don't know what they're talking about. And therefore, mainstream media, and most of the time even non-mainstream media, shouldn't even be read in this regard. So on the 9th of August, most of you know the elections for president were held in Belarus. Now remember, every election cycle, the Western media, Western governments, Western professors, Western liberals, Western neoconservatives, Western oil companies, anybody who's anybody in the West condemns the outcome, condemns Lukashenko, and claims that the election is illegitimate. These are press releases, usually written up in advance. Although in this case, they kind of overshot themselves because the protests began prior to the actual election. We'll talk about that in a minute. I have a few sources from Belarus who've contacted me, giving me a first-hand account of exactly what happened. So it's not true that people took to the streets right after Lukashenko won his 80%, which is pretty normal for him in elections. It was before then. And in fact, if you read Lukashenko's State of the Union on, I believe it was the 2nd, or the 4th, I can't remember, he's talking about protests that began in late July. So this is something that the regime was building. Now, people who know me know that I've been dealing with this topic for years. Alexander Lukashenko is one of my favorite politicians. He's one of my favorite leaders. Like anyone else, he's far from perfect because being a politician means that you're dealing with people, power, institutions, and the complex interactions that make up the discipline of political science. Now, the irritating part here is that, as far as like Lukashenko is, my big concern with him is he saved Belarus from becoming an oligarchy. He built the strongest economy in the CIS. He has the highest standard of living in the CIS. They are a mirror image of Ukraine. He built modern Belarus. He was never a member of the Communist Party. He subsidizes the church. And as far as COVID is concerned, he has condemned the hysteria, condemned the pharmaceutical companies, and really refused to institute really any measures within the country concerning the virus. So that was my concern here, and I've written paper after paper. I'm cited all over the place on him, and very few people really deal with Belarus at all. But it is far more significant than its small size would allow. But every time there's an election, the same thing goes for Putin in Russia. The press releases come out from every elite organization in the West saying that it isn't valid. I want to note that many of these very same organizations will also invest in Belarusian businesses and banks. I've mentioned this many times before, but they speak out of both sides of their mouth. Their political agenda is one thing, but they realize that because the country is run very well, because state-run industries in a country that is pretty much, at least in ideologically unified, clearly as Lukashenko proves. State-run industries are not inefficient. There's no reason to believe that they are more inefficient than private industries, especially since they compete. And like everything else, the attempt to overthrow Lukashenko every few years is about taking that capital, privatizing it, and either shipping it out of the country or taking it over directly. That's what's been happening in Ukraine since the mid-1990s. So there's a few things I want to cover that you're not going to hear anywhere else. The first topic concerns the Election Commission. The Election Commission is completely independent of any government agency. They have about 30,000 people who were sent out to monitor polling places. And several sources I have say these are the same people who were attacked as the voting that day came to an end. The observers from the CIS, including one that I mentioned on Thursday from Azerbaijan, said that there was really no problem here. There is no motive for Lukashenko to falsify election results, primarily because he's exceptionally popular, especially given politicians in the West. But secondarily, he knows that even that slightest irregularity will be blown up and blown out of proportion in the West, and God knows what the result is going to be. I mean, if they're bad now, what would they say if they catch someone stuffing ballot boxes? He has no incentive to do this. The laws are very strict in this regard, and Russia and Belarus have some of the strictest anti-corruption legislation on the planet. Now, the head of the one of the local observers, and I'm quoting from one of them here. This is a statement from the commission itself. Certain political forces, which also nominated their observers, deliberately distorted information about the process and the entire election campaign as a whole. They deliberately became provocative. They threatened citizens and members of election commissions. Insults, threats, and rudeness were normal. Every day we recorded them. Dozens of violations of the law on their part. It's obvious that all these actions are links in one chain aimed at destabilizing the situation in the country and discrediting the elections. They failed. And then, of course, they say we declare the past, the recent political campaign was held in accordance with the electoral law. Voting results conform to the wishes of the citizens. This is an ethnically mixed commission. The CIS, which is the Commonwealth of Independent States, the former republics of the Soviet Union, all had thousands of observers. But the Election Commission are nominated by all the major political parties and political forces. Even individuals can nominate them, public associations. Usually about a third of it comes from the political parties and associations of various types. But those working for the state can't be any more than a third of the commission. And if they're on the commission, they can no longer work for the state for the interim. And you have to collect a certain amount of signatures. It is a standalone body. It is not bound. It doesn't answer to anybody. But if you're a member of a political party and you're on the commission, you have to resign your membership in the party. And if you're caught politicking for the party, you're subject to serious penalties. In America, of course, it's called the Hatch Act, named after Orrin Hatch of Utah, that prevents any state employee or government employee to work for a partisan campaign. So that's the first thing I want to mention. The commission is rationally organized. It answers to nobody, and is nominated by every major political force in the country. So it's as neutral as you can possibly get. So now let me get into a few first-hand sources that I've received privately, although I'm sure that some of these are on personal blogs somewhere in Belarusian or in Russian. And they report that on August 9th, starting in the middle of the day, groups of young people, all wearing white bracelets, began gathering around polling stations in the major cities, especially the capital city of Minsk. This was very sudden. So roughly from 4 p.m., they began to paralyze the process. In fact, even succeeded in shutting down certain polls. And of course, they had early voting. In the Russian case, you had a full week where you can vote for the amendments to the Constitution. But you have a lengthy, many, many hours of voting on the 9th. And yet the point was, of course, to spread out stagger the voting population. Some of these people, even when they went to vote themselves, deliberately stayed in the voting booth and refused to leave, hindering the movement of other voters. A lot of people standing in line didn't want to vote. They were more or less extras. And then when the polling station closed at a certain time, they would scream and yell that they weren't allowed to vote. I have this from a few sources now. So this is big when these groups as night began to fall, they got more and more violent. And allegedly, in some of these, the 33 polling stations which were reported that had this event occur, they stayed open even after the end of the elections. When the minute, it didn't take very long for this. This was determined very quickly that this was sabotage, and it was dealt with. So you had people in the crowds, in the lines, that were deliberately holding them up. As I mentioned before, there were thousands of commission members who were attacked. Now, women made up the majority of the election commission on the ground, and they were constantly being threatened by the so-called protesters. Several had to barricade themselves within the polling station itself, fearing violence. This is when the law enforcement agencies were finally mobilized. And in a few cases, it was funny because they would start protesting even before the polling station closed. They were in front of TV cameras saying, "Oh, the station is closed, I can't vote," and there were still 20 minutes left because apparently they couldn't look at their phones. And so as the voting day came to a close, these people in the white bracelets began to chant and throw things and get all kinds of violence. They began to block traffic, which was one of their first methods. There was a cluster of them at the Palace of Independence, and then of course, they were going to smash it, and it didn't work. The militia was called out, and they drove the young people from the roadway. They set flares off, smoke bombs, and then of course the Molotov cocktails and everything else. And it wasn't just police in Oman that was attacked. These were civilians. Burning people alive in cars was clearly the motivation. Okay, sorry, that was a census worker at my door. And I had to argue quite a bit to get her to put down that I am of American Samoan origin. I was either between that or Alaska Native. I couldn't think of which. Anyway, what I was talking about here was what the protesters were doing as that first day, or the only day, the 9th, came to a close. But clearly this was something that was planted and planned. And within a very short time, you had 40 law enforcement injured at the time, and about 50 civilians. And the way that it developed, according to these sources, on the ground, it was almost identical to Ukraine in 2014. And, they were able to, take the police off guard, although the riot police were deployed, even the day before and even before then, well aware of what was planned. So everything here has been recorded, usually from many angles, and the cases opened against some of these people are all on tape. One of the interesting parts of this was this alleged candidate, Tikhonovskaya, the wife of Tikhonovsky, had a attempt on her life, possibly one of her own supporters. And it was the Ministry of Internal Affairs that initially protected her. If you know anything about this woman, I mean, she knows nothing about politics. And she makes that actually very clear. To get rid of her somehow would be the sacrifice. And this word keeps coming up in the stories I'm hearing. The sacrifice needed to galvanize the opposition. The person sending the death threats has already been identified, and it is not anyone on the government side. One officer said 120 trained personnel were sent to protect her and to get rid of this individual. And then beyond that, of course, there was these alleged strikes. The Western press is saying that entire companies are walking out, and that is simply not true. In a few places in the capital, you have a handful who are walking out, and of course Lukashenko says, you don't come back. It failed miserably. The EU continues to condemn Lukashenko and threatens sanctions. Although I don't know how many more you could put on. The country's already sanctioned. And the demand is to hold new elections. They'll do what they did in Montenegro and just have election after election after election until they get the result they want. And Tikhonovskaya says that she was never threatened, and that is not the reason why she left the country. She's also condemned the violence, not on her behalf by any means, but against Lukashenko. Now, both Russian and Belarusian intelligence have been talking about foreign interference for years now. So this isn't an isolated event. So they've identified individuals have been arrested. And even the opposition parties in parliament supported the work of the security officials. Riots are violent. Riots are brutal. The protesters are just as well armed as the police are. No one's shooting guns here. But it should be noted that one of my sources here in Belarusian intelligence seems to suggest that those arrested Russian citizens were employees of Open Russia, which is Khodorkovsky's organization. So that was the first day. So needless to say, like every election, they condemned it. The EU doesn't recognize Lukashenko, nor have they ever recognized Lukashenko. Now, the Polish Ministry of Foreign Affairs under Paweł Jablonski wants even more than sanctions. And he's worried about sanctions because they may push Belarus deeper into the sphere of Russian influence. And he said this: we don't want the EU's reaction to be limited only to presenting the idea of sanctions or a joint statement. It's needed, but we need to give something more. We should present a real offer to resolve this conflict in a stable manner. But it's only possible if the EU offers Belarus a real perspective of cooperation. I want to send a signal if Belarus begins a process of reforms leading to a system in which citizens decide on the direction of change, which is vague and it means a liberal system, the EU is ready for full cooperation, primarily economic. Belarusians should be able to choose their own development path and have a real choice here. Now, there's a lot of dumb statements are made in times like this, but this is one of the dumbest. He lets the cat out of the bag, first of all, claiming that clearly economic is the issue. Belarusian economy is first world. It is highly industrialized. As far as the eastern markets are concerned, it is deep in China, in Russia, in electronics, IT, automotive. And unemployment in Belarus is the lowest. I think one of the lowest in the world at the end of 2019. They want to make the claim that the official unemployment rate in Ukraine is 8.8%. This shows you how seriously you could take statistics. Officially in Belarus, it's 0.4%. But of course, Belarus is capable of because they didn't lock down very much, they left it up to the enterprises. The economy shrank, but only by a small amount. The truth is that the West and the oligarchs never forgave Lukashenko. He was one of the few that saved his country from what we call neoliberalism. Essentially, neoliberal, neoconservative are identical. Privatization, austerity, tight monetary policy, no tariffs, social liberalism, easy divorce, easy abortion, that kind of thing. And as we all know, it led to mass shutdown, mass unemployment, and the hollowing out of the economies, especially of Ukraine and parts of Central Asia, that they haven't even recovered from. Russia, thank God, did recover thanks to Putin. Lukashenko made sure that Belarus didn't have to recover. Now, another source tells me that there is a part of the Polish Special Services, S. Kozlov, who was a veteran of the GRU Special Forces General Staff, said that there is a so-called White Maidan structure of the Polish Armed Forces. This is called the Central Group of Psychological Actions. And I can't pronounce Polish, and I'm not going to try. But this is a military unit that's subordinate to the Land Forces Command, part of the MTR. This is Psychological Warfare Division. And this is a group that was active in planning one of the groups in Belarusian violence. It is the Intelligence Center for Psychological Struggle. There are 4 departments for collecting and processing information, especially the analysis of mass media. And one of its arms, so to speak, is Nexta. And we're going to talk about Nexta here in just a minute. It's also worth noting, the preview here is that Nexta is the platform used by the protesters to coordinate their actions, even going back to late July. It's worth noting that Lukashenko could have smashed this very, very quickly, like Erdogan did after the coup. He arrested 200,000 people. 76,000 people lost their jobs. Curfew, ban on gatherings, all these typical kind of things. But Lukashenko's done none of this. He's backed down from some of this. He isn't about dissolving this entire structure, and it's because his popularity is firm. He didn't do what someone like Erdogan did in Turkey, or even Lincoln did in the Civil War. But one of the reasons that Lukashenko is popular is things like Family Capital Fund. Long time ago, if you go back to my earlier shows from 2009, 2010, I go into great detail about Lukashenko's family policy. Any child born, and this is separate from tax breaks, gets an immediate grant of roughly $10,000 or 22,500 Belarusian rubles. And it's indexed according to where you live and, colas and everything else. And this goes on straight up until, it's limitless. And in fact, there's an encouragement to have larger families. And this is theirs to use. Everything is subsidized to make sure that the child has everything it needs. And this goes for adoptions as well. And family capital can be invested. It can be used to improve everything. It has to be, there's a certain controls on this, used for education, housing, social services, all the rest of it. And larger families get even larger funds. And this is in addition to other benefits. So that's just one example. Lifetime employment like you had in South Korea, stable monetary policy, stable interest rates, state-centered central bank, tightly controlled currency, and state enterprises compete with the others. Now, the other reason he's popular, among many others. I shouldn't say the other one. There's many of them. Is his relationship with the world. His relationship with Moscow has been more or less complicated. I've been talking about this since the 90s. And he's able to, clearly he's pro-Russian in almost every way. He's close to Syria, Venezuela, and clearly he's an enemy of the U.S., only to the extent that the U.S. its official ideology is liberalism. His social nationalism, as I've termed it over the years, is at war with neoliberalism. And he jealously guards the sovereignty of the country, whether it be from the West or from Russia. But as far as sanctions are concerned, the Lithuanians seem to be more militant. Gabriel Landsbergis, who I remember back in the 90s as being one of the original post-Soviet leaders of Lithuania, he said this. He's the head of the opposition party in parliament. He says, Lithuania must clearly, quickly, and unambiguously formulate and consolidate strategic provisions for the Belarusian regime at the EU and even in the transatlantic, meaning the US level, to be an icebreaker in the fight for freedom and against tyranny. Sanctions must also send a signal to other influential members of the regime. Continue to support Lukashenko will mean stalemate and further sanctions against a wider range of the current elite. Well, that sounds great, except that if Germany isn't going to enforce sanctions on Russia, they're not going to enforce it on Belarus either. I've gone into great detail on what sanctions actually are. Lithuania is a tiny country, formerly Russian many centuries ago. But we realize, and I didn't know this immediately in 2014, but they were essential in funneling funds to the Ukrainian Maidan, and as was Poland. And both countries, especially Lithuania, has been involved in escalating tensions, and they call it de-Sovietization and de-Russification of Eastern Europe, which is an odd way to put it, since, of course, you can't be a Soviet state and have private industry, and have churches being subsidized. Now, I mentioned Nexta. Nexta is a Telegram channel. Two leaders of this so-called opposition and the violence, Roman Protasevich and Stephen Protasevich, sorry. And I think Svetlov is his handle online. They both live in Warsaw, of course, and they coordinate the Belarusian opposition for some time now. Nexta is essentially now an anti-Lukashenko platform in Poland. Now, Protasevich used to be a journalist for Euro Radio, which was funded by both Poland and Lithuania, as well as Radio Liberty. In fact, Nexta was founded by Stephen Putila, and he worked for Belsat, which is a Polish-Belarusian channel aimed against Belarus, financed by the Polish Foreign Ministry, and of course, which automatically ties them into Central Intelligence Agency. So there can be no question about it. Vladimir Zhabarov, who was at the Russian parliament today, said this about the protests. The processes that began immediately after the closure of the polling stations indicate that they were prepared, staged, because the actions that took place there cannot be prepared in a few hours. Specially trained people were needed. I'm not saying that there were those who were now only trying to shake things up in Belarus. There were many others who were unhappy. There were some complaints, but the instigators were aiming to undermine the situation in Belarus, no doubt about it. The Maidan in Minsk will not work. Lukashenko is not Yanukovych, who got on a plane, flew to Kharkiv, next day to Crimea, and then to Rostov, which he received from the hands of his people. There's simply no reason for him to falsify anything. As I've said elsewhere, Sergei Lebedev, the head of the CIA election observer group, said the elections in Belarus were held in an organized, consistent way in accordance with the laws of the country. I've mentioned before that people like Pompeo are talking about, he says, the United States wants to help Belarus build its own sovereign country. Our energy producers stand ready to deliver 100% of your oil you need at competitive prices. Your nation should not be forced to be dependent on any one partner for your prosperity or for your security. So here's a second quote, clearly meaning that this whole thing is economic, as it almost always is. I've also mentioned elsewhere the 3 Cs initiative, which the riots in Belarus are tightly connected to. The TSI creates a network, ultimately, of pro-Western, more or less neoliberal states as a buffer between Germany and Russia. And this goes way back. It is a nightmare as it was before World War I, for the Western banking establishment to have an alliance of Russia and Germany, which seems to be the case more and more. So this is a corridor of 12 countries in the EU, starting from the Baltic and going straight down to the Adriatic. Right now it's Austria, Bulgaria, Croatia, and Czechia, Estonia, Hungary, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, Romania, Slovakia, and Slovenia. By themselves, of course, these countries don't have much clout, but together, under American guidance, they do. It's just a front for American oil and gas giants. Because the only thing they really care about is creating a new natural gas pipeline that will bypass Nord Stream 2. So, that's ultimately what it comes down to. Now, many people have talked about the RAND report from 2019, giving the possibility of a color revolution in Belarus. Well, few people have read this, and what they say is, and I'm quoting them, from the U.S. policy standpoint, Belarus unrest might present an opportunity to extend Russia by aiding at the opposition, removing a long-standing Russian allied dictator, and supporting liberalization. Aid to Lukashenko's opposition could come in a variety of forms: public declarations, support by U.S. leaders, direct financial and organizational assistance, helping the opposition parties reach the end state of being free and democratic. The U.S. can adopt precisely the opposite approach and try to leverage the recent unrest to build ever closer relationship with Lukashenko's regime through offers of economic aid. But even if U.S. efforts to boost local opposition to the existing regime in Minsk fail to bring about change, the existence of such a campaign would create apprehensions among Russian leaders who have tended to exaggerate the Western role in other color revolutions and even worry about the prospect of such a movement in their own country. Well, this is the best that these guys can come up with. In other words, even if the color revolution fails, we can provoke them into action, and we could use that to blame them. They're coming straight out, and here they're saying that the Russians tend to exaggerate Western influence in color revolutions as they're talking about leading it themselves. I don't know how they just don't see the blatant contradiction here. Polling from both Ukraine and Russia show Lukashenko at roughly between 70 and 80% popularity. It depends on where you go. His result, as always, is in line with his popularity rating, as is Putin's in Russia. The very same report from the RAND Corporation says that the Socioeconomic and Political Research Survey in 2015 said that 70% of Belarusians did not want a Ukrainian-style revolution. Well, there's good reason for this. That's because Kiev is a failed state. The state, as an institution, is popular in Belarus because any fool could see the destruction around them, especially in Ukraine, was brought about by neoliberalism. And this is why Lukashenko is not just the most popular politician in Belarus, but he is also the most popular politician in Ukraine. I want to share, and this is really the comedy section of the presentation here. I'm at the election program of Svetlana Tikhonovskaya. Now remember, this woman admits to having no knowledge of politics whatsoever. This woman fully admits to really not caring. She, of course, was an English teacher throughout Western Europe, especially in Ireland. And, of course, fluent in English, which you would have to be for a lot of these things. The two guys I mentioned before leading the opposition, they're babies. These are all young people. If you look at Hong Kong, no one's over 21. I've read this, and this is in Russian and Belarusian. I can't make sense of it. This isn't a program. She says here, I want to become the president of the Republic of Belarus, not for the sake of the position, but in order to return you the right to choose. In other words, I want to become president so you can vote for president. There isn't a single solitary aspect of a normal platform here. She tells people not to vote early so your vote is not stolen. Or really to make sure to pack the polling places at night, as we've already discussed. I've been through this platform many times. 99% of it is about the election. There's some, and I know she didn't write this, clearly someone with public policy background wrote this, about the polling stations, how they're designed. Then she says, when I'm elected, the same officials will rule as rule now, except for those who were involved in, she says, blatantly and openly violated the law. And political criminals will be released. We're not entirely sure what that means exactly. There is nothing here. There isn't a single public policy recommendation. The closest that she comes, it's not even, I've heard elsewhere her say that she's going to break the Union Treaty with Russia. Well, of course, that's purely a CIA thing. But that is it. It's not even on here. I'm on her page right now. I have no idea. But, here's something here about healthcare. This doesn't show you what's going on here. Now, this is my translation. I'm doing it off the top of my head. In order for doctors to be satisfied with high salaries and people with their care, we need a system, money for treatment, whether from state budget or from voluntary insurance contributions, follow the patient to medical institutions, both state and non-state. Then, the quality of medicine and the salaries of well-working doctors will increase. Good doctors will increase. She's talking about privatizing the health service here. She says it in a very roundabout way. But she doesn't know the first thing. This is clearly written by somebody else. She has absolutely nothing to say here. What little she does have to say is written in such a way that there's no way to tell. It's absolutely comic. Now, I mentioned on Thursday that when her husband was arrested, it was it wasn't domestic violence. He allegedly beat up a few women at one of his wife's campaign rallies after he was released from prison for something else. See, I can't keep up with this guy. Sergei Tikhonovsky, was a YouTube blogger supporting vague liberalism. At the time of his arrest, he had about 150,000 subscribers. And I said with Sven, oh, sure, I have 150,000 subscribers. Let me run for president. Does that make any sense? And by the way, his page is still up. Well, he's been arrested more than once, and the police raided his mother's house where he spent a lot of time, and they found $900,000 in U.S. bills. All of this was dismissed by the Amnesty International, all the corporate NGOs, as always, without an explanation or any investigation whatsoever. Why is anyone voting for this? There were about 9 so-called opposition candidates against Lukashenko. All but one could barely get 100,000 signatures, which you need to be able to register. And then when her husband was arrested, she, through power of attorney, was able to take his place. This is one of the reasons that they didn't register the movement initially, because they needed him to be there. They made an exception in her case. So this is very convoluted, but she is the perfect front woman. Average looking, absolutely nothing interesting intellectually, physically, in terms of personality or anything else. She's not a great speaker. She could be told what to do. She comes right out and says, I don't really have an agenda. I just want to make elections easier. It's always very difficult for people to come out and say, I'm going to impose neoliberalism on the country. I don't know why they just don't say that if it's such a great ideology. But, as always, it's the same groups. CIA, National Endowment for Democracy, the International Republican Institute, the National Democratic Institute, USAID, all the same tactics, all the same groups of people. And writers like Stephen Ledman and a few others have spoken of the idea of full spectrum dominance. Pentagon's idea of total domination, which is really the ultimate goal of globalization, the New World Order. The use of swarming, which is a mental technique. It's when an idea so saturates the airwaves that it takes on a life even bigger than life itself. It's a way to strike from all directions. It's almost a mental version of a military attack. Now, there are several in Belarus who've been talking about the color revolution, the so-called slipper revolution. That's been going on since last spring. So the issue, of course, and what most people are talking about is the relationship between Putin and Lukashenko. There was a phone conversation yesterday where Lukashenko wanted to renew the Union Treaty, and this was something that he was always very suspicious of. 1999 treaty essentially lays out economic integration and cooperation at all levels, but most importantly, to defend both nations from foreign threats. What happens to Belarus happens to Russia. But there was no sense of any kind of subordination. But here's what Lukashenko said on the 4th of August in his what amounts to this State of the Union. Belarus is not friends with someone against someone. We're for a multi-vector, consistent, predictable foreign policy. Russia has always been, is, and will be our closest ally, no matter who is in power in Belarus or in Russia. This is an insurmountable factor, deep within our peoples. In spite of the fact that fraternal relations with us have changed to partnership, or from partnership. I see what's happening now with the election campaign. Remember, this was long before the election took place. You, as well as members of the election commissions, are under tremendous pressure. It got to the point that threats and insults are poured on members of the election commissions. But you should know, the state will not abandon you. It will protect you. You will have found justice for these extremists. Therefore, do not even worry for your life or safety with the safety of your children. I guarantee you that. For those who want another president, go to the square, go to the polling station and vote. But don't forget that the president is the head of the state, your state, who in accordance to the Constitution personifies the unity of the nation, which is the face of your country, your face. The Constitution should not provoke a political crisis, cause paralysis, as it did in the 90s. For those who've forgotten or don't know, let me remind you. Then we were mired in endless political disputes and debates at the expense of making urgent decisions. The country was sliding into the abyss, and the people were on the brink of survival. I've already given an example. Gangs and oligarchs wielded from Moscow to the border with the Polish Republic, robbing everyone. A car, a little more expensive than theirs, they stopped it, they threw it away. He resisted, they were shot and thrown down a slope. I'm both ashamed and scared to remember how we fought against these bandits. But we cleared them out of the way in 6 months. 32 gangs in Minsk alone. Manaskovich remembers how the last businessman was shot. I remember everything that was blamed on the government. On Manaskovich. 32 gangs, 32 oligarchical clans. I want to add, they were well armed and were far stronger than the police. I demanded to put a list on the table of the bandits and clean them up. Our generals didn't have any lists. And only young guys from the KGB and the Ministry of Internal Affairs called for the fight against corruption and brought me the list of the oligarchs. In 6 months, we cleared Minsk of gangs like Zhukov or Odessa. Do you want the 1990s? This is what we want the country to be divided into sectors and collect tribute. I don't want this, and it won't be mine. It won't be while I'm alive. I put it all on my shoulders. There was very little left. Only a couple of people who went around with pistols drove around destroying these scum. We passed it. We saved Belarus. As always, he's very plain-spoken. The oligarchs in Belarus, as very few people understand, were even more vicious than that of Russia. They were closely connected, of course. But he's not too far off the mark. I mean, he was there on the front lines. He was a soldier himself. Open violence, clear gang warfare with no law and no order was the case in the early 90s in Belarus. There's absolutely no question about it. That's what happens when liberalism is imposed on these nations. That's the gangster capitalism that these people want right now. Now, the next thing, really the last thing I want to discuss here, is the military situation. Now, this is one of the funnier ones, too, because of how NATO has responded to this. Remember, NATO's been building up forces in the U.S. Unilaterally, building up forces in Lithuania and Poland for years, since at least 2014. So clearly there's builds up and there's exercises going on all the time. And as a result, Lukashenko has ordered the deployment of an air assault brigade to the border. And there are exercises going on, U.S.-led NATO exercises, using Poland, Lithuania, and other, the rest of the partners. Lukashenko said we cannot calmly observe this and do nothing. That was the nature of the phone call to Putin, was to make sure that this can be countered. Now, no one believes that there's going to be an invasion. But they've told themselves that Russia's going to, for some reason, invade, whether it be Lithuania or Finland or Poland. No one knows why, but that's what these people are told. And he noted the buildup that's been going on for years, which, of course, now NATO denies. Lukashenko says, well, this buildup would have been fine, but there's an escalation and a buildup of armed component of these territories. We cannot turn a blind eye to it. We cannot observe this calmly. Early in the morning, I was listening to the report of the Chief of the General Staff. I noticed our military is worried about this problem. There is a extension of military exercises on the Belarusian border. Now, the funny thing is, not that long ago, well, I should say, the build has been going on for a long time, but it was on the 15th of this month where the U.S. and Poland signed a treaty increasing their military cooperation. So another 1,000 American soldiers will be sent to Polish territory. And the Polish government has been waiting, or so they say, for an increase in the American contingent to contain Russia, as if they're planning on invading anytime soon. The U.S. and Poland are stepping up their military cooperation. And a defense agreement, and not to mention a huge contract to Boeing and several other defense contractors, has been signed on the 15th. The Polish newspapers note that the agreement provides for the transfer to Poland of part of the headquarters of the 5th Corps of the U.S. Army. The details, as of right now, are still unknown. And there are 4,500 American soldiers in Poland, but that doesn't mean anything. There are many mercenaries, but that's what's on paper. They're not going to give you their exact numbers in the New York Times. Then, one day later, August 16, NATO says they did not increase military presence in Eastern Europe, but they're closely monitoring the situation in Belarus. And NATO's reaction was, there is no NATO buildup in the region. NATO's multinational presence in the eastern part of the alliance does not pose any threat to any country. And that was a TASS-quoted NATO spokesman, Lungescu, saying that. So on the 15th, they signed a defense pact increasing the American presence in Poland. On the 16th, NATO denies an increase in American or NATO troop strength in Poland. Why would this be the case on the 15th of August as the unrest in Belarus is continuing? Now, building up forces around China, around Russia, has been going on since the mid-90s. It's quadrupled since Putin took power. It's a major error of the Trump administration that he's going to start some more troops from Germany to Poland. Germany is no longer an American ally. And no one's entirely sure what security threat from Russia is happening here. But if they can tear Belarus away from Russia or create such unrest that military action is possible, they're going to threaten it. But the RAND report, as you remember, stated that the point has more to do with provoking them to action than actually doing anything themselves. And Trump was very excited about the monetary obligation to NATO that Poland has now finally coughed up, and then attacked Germany. Not a whole lot of people are talking about the fact that Germany has largely defected both from the EU and from NATO. Trump said that American forces will be removed from Germany and sent to either Poland or Lithuania. It just so happens that the opposition is connected with a Polish military unit using the Next platform to coordinate riots in Belarus. You don't have to be a genius to figure this out. I mean, it helps. But this is very clear. And among many other things, this just a couple of days ago, the Air Force is going to rotate the MQ-9 drone squadron into Poland, then establish an aerial port there, which is under construction, I think, right now, since the agreement was signed on the 15th. So the American military, or the troop level in Germany, is going to be reduced to 25,000. And they're heading towards Poland. Now, this has been going on in dribs and drabs for a long time now. The Nord Stream 2 pipeline is at the center of it. When Germany defected from the EU and said, we're supporting this pipeline, it's the best, the most efficient way to get natural gas, oil from Russia to Europe and to us, that was it. Germany was slowly being edged out of the alliance. There's nothing there. The Atlantic Alliance is a paper tiger. There's no money that isn't being printed by the Fed. If you go to my Patreon page, you'll read article after article about the condition of the U.S. military. Now, the allegation is that Poland has been begging the U.S. for a greater and larger military presence. Now, I don't know exactly how true that is. The formal name of the agreement is the U.S.-Poland Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement, signed on August 15th. Now, it's pretty clear that you can't do that in a week. The elections were on the 9th. That treaty was signed on the 15th. So that's not enough time to get everything together, clearly, for something of that significance. So everything is very tightly connected. So this is one of the more disturbing elements here. And using Belarus as, both Belarus and Ukraine had that one thing in common, and that no one really knew anything about them. I mean, Russia's bad enough. But Ukraine and Belarus are so obscure to Americans that you could pretty much say anything, and they'll believe it. I've yet to get a straight answer to the question, what threat does Russia pose to Central Europe? Stalin invaded Poland the same day Hitler did. The difference, of course, is nationalism, as I've said many times before. Keep in mind, of course, that these two poor souls, Tikhanovsky and Tikhanovskaya, are absolutely insignificant here. I have to applaud their use of Svetlana here because she is so clueless that you could tell she's very good-natured. Now, being an English speaker, a fluent English speaker, working in Western Europe, who knows what her background is? It's very easy for someone like that to be approached. I have no idea. But the very fact that there's been no real crackdown, like in the Turkish way, on Belarusian society shows you something. The fact that his YouTube page is still up, but there's nothing. These people could hardly get 100,000 signatures. This means that there's no threat to Lukashenko. Why are they going to bother? Why are these popular politicians, Putin in Russia, Lukashenko in Belarus, why are they going to bother bringing the wrath of the West on themselves by trying to attack somebody who poses no threat to them? It's true Lukashenko did point her out in his speech. It was in the very same context that I mentioned. You go back to the 1994 Constitution, or actually even earlier than that, you'll see the destruction of the state. He talks about the gang violence. No one denies this. It was reported in Western press every day at the time. I remember it very well. But when Svetlana could only get 109,479 signatures, and, it could have been very easy for the election commission to wipe out, to not accept them, bring her under 100,000. But those accepted were 104,757. They knocked off, 40,000 from Lukashenko's list. The commission doesn't discriminate here. So the situation here is very, very clear. If you're a YouTuber and you have 150,000 subscribers, the first thing that should enter your mind is, oh, I'm going to run for president now. I still can't get over this. And beyond all of this, of course, Lukashenko's rejection of COVID-19, his connection. We could go on with all of these variables that lead to this violence being planned for a very long time. They're doing the kneeling thing like in the U.S. They're wearing the white bracelets, of course. They were at the polling stations on Election Day, deliberately disrupting it, shutting them down until the police were finally called. Those who have been arrested, many of them a huge number of them, in fact, are either from Ukraine or Russia. As I mentioned, at least 2 were from Khodorkovsky's group. I'm not willing to say that they're going to start World War III here because the U.S. is going to be beaten very badly. That's not what I'm arguing. But they would love there to be a provocation. They would love there to be somewhat of an overreaction. From all the videos I know, I've watched hours of footage now, and the police have been extremely restrained. I don't know, I couldn't be a cop for 5 minutes. I'd just start mowing these people down. They're absolutely vicious human beings. In Ukraine, they were being pumped up on uppers from the U.S. Embassy. I can't think of the drug. It was something I never heard of before. Clearly, these people are on the same thing here. If you could actually see their movements and their jerkiness and everything else. Last but not least, we'll say that Lukashenko's rallies have been huge in the capital, just like Assad's were before the civil war that the U.S. provoked. Anyway, everybody, that's the situation in Belarus. Thank you, everyone, for listening. I'll talk to you next time. Bye-bye.